History as it happens, June 13th, 2024. Do not give me you're tired, you're poor.
The Statue of Liberty is not some relic of American history. It stands for who we are as the United States.
Last week, Crooked Joe signed an executive order that is pro-invasion, pro-child trafficking, pro-woman trafficking, pro-human trafficking.
So I will never demonize immigrants. I'll never refer to immigrants as poisoning the blood of a country. And further, I'll never separate children from their families at the border.
In this election year, immigration may be the most important issue of all, and it's almost always talked about as a problem that has to be stopped. A crime that requires more toughness, more enforcement like detentions and deportations. And now President Biden, via executive order, is trying to seal the border to most asylum seekers. A move that by itself will not fix the asylum system or address the reasons why the huddled masses come to America. That's next as we report history as it happens. A podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
I have real disagreements and concerns with this executive action because I think it plays into the current Republican talking points.
I believe in the idea of amnesty for those who have put down roots and who have lived here, even though some time back they may have entered illegally.
If Joe Biden truly wanted to sign an executive order to stop the invasion, right now all he needs to do is say, I hereby immediately reinstate every single border policy of a gentleman named Donald J. Trump.
Ask anyone from economists to lawmakers to policy experts. There is no question that the immigration system has to be reformed writ large, and that right now, the system as it exists, which hasn't been updated since 1990, has not given people in the world enough legal avenues to come to the United States. That's actually going to hurt the United States.
My name is David Grossberg, and I'd like to know, do you think the children of illegal aliens should be allowed to attend Texas public schools free? Or do you
April 4th, 1980, a Republican primary debate in Houston between Ronald Reagan and George Bush.
Who are you addressing that to?
I think you're first in this.
He was looking right at you. I said he was. Look.
The number of migrants crossing the southern border then was much smaller than it is today, but this clip is still worth listening to understand how immigration politics have changed.
I'd like to see something done about the illegal alien problem that would be so sensitive and so understanding about labor needs and human needs that problem wouldn't come up. But today, if those people are here, I would reluctantly say I think they would get whatever it is that they're, what the society is giving to their neighbors. But the problem has to be solved. The problem has to be solved because as we have kind of made illegal some kinds of labor that I'd like to see legal, we're doing two things. We're creating a whole society of really honorable, decent, family-loving people that are in violation of the law, and secondly, we're exacerbating relations with Mexico. The answer to your question is much more fundamental than whether they attend Houston schools, it seems to me. I don't want to see if they're living here, I don't want to see a whole thing of 6- and 8-year-old kids being made, one totally uneducated and made to feel that they're living with outside the law. Let's address ourselves to the fundamentals. These are good people, strong people. Part of my family is a Mexican.
Can I add to that? I think the time has come that the United States and our neighbors, particularly our neighbor to the south, should have a better understanding and a better relationship than we've ever had. And I think that we haven't been sensitive enough to our size and our power. They have a problem of 40 to 50% unemployment. Now, this cannot continue without the possibility arising with regard to that other country that we talked about, of Cuba and what it is stirring up, of the possibility of trouble below the border, and we could have a very hostile and strange neighbor on our border. Rather than making them or talking about putting up a fence, why don't we work out some recognition of our mutual problems, make it possible for them to come here legally with a work permit, and then while they're working and earning here, they pay taxes here. And when they want to go back, they can go back, and they can cross and open the border both ways by understanding their problems. This is the only safety valve right now they have with that unemployment that probably keeps the lid from blowing off down there. And I think we could have a fine relationship, and it was
1980 was the same year Congress passed the Refugee Act, which provided the first statutory basis for asylum in U.S. history. The new law formally adopted the United Nations definition of refugee, established after the Second World War. Asylum is supposed to protect people fleeing political oppression, an obligation the United States failed during the war when it turned away many Jews. But the asylum system was never intended to deal with the size of the waves of desperate human beings crossing the southern border, who, because there are no other legal avenues to enter, seek asylum instead. This has caused a massive backlog of cases and has made the journey to reach the United States a dangerous one, as migrants are exploited by smugglers and cartels. So President Biden signed an executive order denying asylum to migrants who cross in between official ports of entry.
Today, I'm announcing actions to bar migrants who cross our southern border unlawfully from receiving asylum. Migrants will be restricted from receiving asylum at our southern border unless they seek it after entering through an established lawful process. And those who seek to come to the United States legally, for example, by making an appointment and coming to a port of entry, asylum will still be available to them, still available.
Immigration may be the most important issue of all this election year, if not number one, definitely in the top 5. And public opinion is increasingly intolerant, given the chaos at the border. A CBS News poll found 60% of voters, including a third of Democrats and 9 in 10 Republicans, would support efforts to deport all people in the country illegally. Just under half support the idea of setting up large government detention centers to sort out which people ought to be deported. These attitudes are not surprising, given the record number of migrants who've crossed the border over the past several years, but also given the way the issue is framed, is talked about almost entirely as a law enforcement problem, an invasion.
Another migrant caravan from Central America making its way to our southern border. It's a mass of about 1,000 people.
Meanwhile, the terror threat at the southern border continues to grow.
We now understand another caravan has formed and is on the move.
And the presumptive Republican nominee is the country's leading immigration demagogue.
The invasion is just a disaster, what's happened. It's never happened like this. In less than 4 years, Crooked Joe has imported more illegal aliens into our country than at any other time in the history of our country, times maybe 50.
It is less often you hear political figures address the realities that our country needs immigrants. They're mostly not thugs and criminals. Yes, there are costs when a local community has to suddenly deal with an influx of newcomers, but that there is no way to deport our way out of the problem. Here is Texas Democratic Congressman Greg Casar in an interview with MSNBC.
That has the president today responding by restricting asylum, which isn't going to work because it doesn't actually reduce the number of people being pushed out of their homes in Latin America. It doesn't actually create new legal pathways for people to migrate here. And so I think we need an alternative, progressive vision for what will work on the border. And that's why today I'm announcing that I'm drafting legislation to drastically reduce the amount that the United States is contributing to forced migration. I think if we want to address what's happening at the border, we need to create legal pathways so that folks don't have to go to the cartels or wait in line at the border.
Elevating enforcement as the primary tool to solve immigration is not new, of course. In the 1990s, the Clinton administration cracked down on illegal aliens, as they were called, in part to defend against attacks from the right.
The jobs they hold might otherwise be held by citizens or legal immigrants. The public service they use impose burdens on our taxpayers. That's why our administration has moved aggressively to secure our borders more, by hiring a record number of new border guards, by deporting twice as many criminal aliens as ever before, by cracking down on illegal hiring, by barring welfare benefits to illegal aliens. In the budget I will present to you, we will try to do more to speed the deportation of illegal aliens who are arrested for crimes, to better identify illegal aliens in the workplace, as recommended by the commission headed by former Congresswoman Barbara Jordan.
And after 9/11, immigration became a national security problem, and the Department of Homeland Security received enormous funding to police people trying to enter the country. Meantime, it's been about 30 years since Congress passed any serious, comprehensive reforms of the immigration system. All of this and more is documented in a superb new book, Everyone Who Is Gone Is Here, The United States, Central America, and the Making of a Crisis by Jonathan Blitzer, a staff writer for The New Yorker. I reviewed his book a couple months ago. I'll share a link to my review in my weekly newsletter. Sign up at historyasithappens.com or find History As It Happens on Substack. I'm thrilled Jonathan Blitzer is joining us here. Hello and welcome.
Thanks for having me.
So President Biden is signing an executive order to restrict asylum applications as a policy. What are your thoughts on this? Can it be effective?
Well, first of all, I will say the administration has created a slight misimpression about how restrictive this policy is. I mean, it is restrictive, there's no question. And we should talk about that, the historical underpinnings that led to that, the sense of kind of dire political circumstances that forced the administration's hand and so on. But just on a factual level, to be clear, and it's in fact very interesting that the administration elides these details, the president says this is the equivalent to shutting down the border or kind of foreclosing the possibility of asylum altogether. It does not do that. What it does is it says for people who cross the border in between ports of entry. Ordinarily, what happens is what the administration wants to have happen is it wants people to show up at ports of entry where there are sort of minimal facilities and staff to process people. And so the idea is to try to incentivize people to come to ports of entry and to cross less in between the ports of entry. And so what this order does is it targets the population of people crossing in between ports of entry, and it does essentially take asylum off the table for them. But what should be said through all of this is people arriving at ports of entry can still seek asylum. And in fact, the administration has worked hard, and we can talk about kind of the merits of this and on an operational level how successful it's been, but they have essentially, through the use of an app called CBP One, allowed people to make 1,450 appointments every day at these ports of entry. So people can seek asylum that way. But on the whole, there's no question. The approach in between ports of entry is very restrictive. I think the thinking behind it from the administration standpoint is twofold. First, on a policy level, the thought is if we can communicate a certain harshness and if we can deliver results swiftly for people who are arriving. In other words, make very clear to people who arrive that your case won't languish for years, that you won't have this open door to live in the country while we wait months and months for a judge to eventually hear your claim. Then we can send a message to people in the region that they can't game the asylum system to come to the United States. That's the sort of policy aim. So it's essentially meant to send a deterrent message to people. I'm skeptical about whether that will work. Only because right now, the biggest problem that the U.S. government faces is one of resources at the southern border. So there are more people arriving at the southern border than the government can easily handle or process. The administration has requested more money from Congress. Congress has balked at giving them any money. And so one of the themes of the Biden administration has been that they haven't even really had a chance often to fully screen people for asylum because they don't have the means to hold them for long enough to go through those motions.
So are you saying then that all the folks who are crossing anywhere on the border that's not a port of entry, that they're unlikely to then go to a port of entry now and try to get in that way?
The rough thinking is that if the government can penalize people who cross in between ports of entry and keep open these limited avenues for those who show up at ports of entry, that the government can effectively manage or redirect the flow of people. Of course, in practicality, it's very complicated because there's a finite number of slots open at a port of entry at any given time. And this will, of course, create a massive bottleneck. There are already huge delays at ports of entry for people to get appointments. And so, that's just an administrative hurdle that's going to exist that there's sort of no way to outrun. And so it's unclear on a practical level what this is going to start to look like as the numbers of people who show up at ports increase.
Yeah, because they'd have to wait on a very long line, right?
Yeah.
And reading from a newspaper article about this, there would be limited exceptions to the restrictions, including for minors who cross the border alone, victims of human trafficking, and those who use a Customs and Border Protection app. You mentioned that already, to schedule an appointment with a border officer to request asylum. But it does sound like this is going to stay in effect for the time being because the policy kicks in once 7-day average for daily illegal crossings hits 2,500. That's a regular occurrence. The border would reopen only after that figure drops to 1,500 for 7 days in a row and stays that way for 2 weeks. I mean, there's no chance that's going to happen anytime soon, right?
There's an organization called the American Immigration Council, which did a really thoughtful analysis of the terms of this executive order and the implications. And as part of that analysis, they kind of took a historical survey of what border crossings have looked like on this daily average on a month-to-month level over the last several years. And with the exception of 2020, which was an odd year because of the pandemic, it halted migration in all kinds of ways that can't really be replicated. In 5 of the last 6 years, every month but one has seen more than 2,500 daily average crossings, which is to say that it's extraordinarily unlikely that by the terms of this executive order, the numbers will ever drop to a level that will lift the suspension that's put in place.
But there's still this idea out there, you alluded to it before, about shutting down the border. It's impossible to physically shut down a 2,000-mile border. If people can't cross legally, they'll still enter in between ports of entry. They'll just do it in a more risk-taking fashion where they don't apply for any asylum at all, or they try to avoid federal law enforcement entirely, and they'll just try to dodge law enforcement for as long as they're here, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of like one of those really complicated things to unpack all of the ways in which it's misleading to say that the government's shutting down the border. As you say, I mean, first of all, it's a physical, geographic, topographic impossibility with 2,000 miles of border and the limited number of agents and enforcement resources and so on. But also, it's sort of wrong-headed to suggest that you're shutting down the border also because there's this issue of the ports of entry, which we've discussed. And of course, there's the fact that every single day, hundreds of thousands of people cross back and forth between the United States and Mexico, conducting commerce, tourism, all of the sort of regular things that make the economies to the north and south of the border function. So this idea that there's any government action that can seal up the border once and for all it's a political fantasy. But what's so kind of devastating to watch happen is one side, and particularly Trump, has really kind of trumpeted this idea of shutting down the border. And Democrats, who are really not great on this issue because they kind of they don't have a clear message. They don't even have that much agreement inside their own ranks, are kind of quick to try to replicate that language because they don't want to be seen as being somehow less tough than the Republicans. And so we kind of get in this loop where everyone's talking about shutting down the border and no one's acknowledging that that doesn't really mean anything.
And you establish that pattern in your reporting. You show time and again how common sense measures were sacrificed on the altar of political expediency, or one side feeling like, they can't go too far on the side of compassion because then they'll be accused of not being tough on illegal immigrants who are coming into the country and causing all these problems. And there's another unintended consequence of stiffening enforcement at the border as well, and that is people who are here without proper documentation. In past decades, past eras, they would have gone back over the border to their home country again, and they kind of came and went, the patterns of labor, agricultural workers, etc. But now they're, quote, stuck here. They can't get back over the border.
I would say sort of two general observations in relation to that. It's a good point. The first is just as a historical data point, there was a very important law passed by Congress in 1996 and signed by Bill Clinton in the months before, weeks before the general election in 1996, that really drastically increased enforcement of immigration laws in the United States and was really deeply punitive in a way that nothing that we had ever seen, a kind of a domestic enforcement measure, had ever looked like before. And one of the consequences was it created what were called bars to people eventually regularizing their status, where if they had been living in the United States without their papers in order for more than a year or more than several years, these bars would then kick into effect, and it would basically prevent them from regularizing their status for between 5 and 10 years. And so what did that do? That froze people in place, and it also disincentivized people to try to regularize their status. And so you actually saw, as one of the consequences of that law, an explosion in the undocumented population living in the United States, because these people would have immediately availed themselves of an opportunity to regularize their status, but now there were penalties if they tried. And so you actually saw the number of people who were undocumented soar as a result of that law. The second point I want to make in relation to your good observation about this is we're only ever talking about enforcement at the border. We're not ever talking simultaneously about reforming the legal immigration system. Ask anyone from economists to lawmakers to policy experts. There is no question that the immigration system has to be reformed writ large, and that right now, the system as it exists, which hasn't been updated since 1990, has not given people in the world enough legal avenues to come to the United States, that's actually going to hurt the United States. Our population is going to decline, and our economy is going to fail without immigrant labor, without the economy dynamized by immigrant labor. But so we're in this constant feedback loop of rhetorical obsession with emphasizing toughness of the border and these kind of policy measures that are passed piecemeal along the way to increase enforcement of the border, but no simultaneous or corresponding measures are taken to also open up legal pathways that would eventually relieve pressure at the southern border because people would take advantage of pathways to come to the United States. People are coming to the United States because they are desperate to. No enforcement measure at the southern border is going to change people's calculus in that regard.
Let's think about that for a second. Last major legislation, 1990. That is 34 years ago. Last president to embrace amnesty, Ronald Reagan, in the mid-1980s. A lot of people have forgotten that. But that was a different Republican Party. You say here immigration policy is governed by a politics of permanent crisis with the border as its staging ground. Yes, we narrowly focus on this one aspect of it, everything happening at the border. You go on to write, one of the core premises of U.S. immigration policy, true under Democrats as well as Republicans, is deterrence. Turn away enough people and others will stop trying to come. I mean, that's really politics there. Let's talk a little bit about the politics of what President Biden is doing here. It seems pretty obvious to me that he needs to do this because there's an election coming up and immigration is arguably the most important issue on people's minds.
Absolutely. I have sort of two general feelings about the politics of this vis-a-vis Biden. The first is one of actual sympathy for the situation the Biden administration is in. This system has not worked for years. And we talk right now about the so-called immigration crisis or the border crisis. In many ways, you could say that crisis has existed for more than a decade because we've known that the system as it exists cannot address the global need, either on the legal immigration front or at the southern border where people are arriving desperate for protection or opportunity.
Yeah, this is a global problem. You're right. We're in an era right now of global migration. Go ahead.
Absolutely. No, 100%. And that's the other thing too with this. And this is another reason why I do feel sympathetic to the Biden administration. And frankly, I would feel sympathetic to any American administration that's sort of forced to answer for global forces that it can't control. There's this idea somehow that if only we were tougher at the southern border, all of these dynamics would change. And the world doesn't work like that. The world is so much more complicated than that. We recognize that the world is more complicated than that in our daily lives. But the politics on this issue that are fed to us day after day by people in Washington really make this seem like it boils down to these very kind of baseline, obvious principles. And it's obviously, that's not how the world operates. But I think from a political standpoint, there's no question the Biden administration has a problem. I don't mean to gloss over the fact that the Biden administration has certainly had missteps on a policy level. I mean, it's been a real mixed bag for this administration. There's no question about it. But one of the things that's been very striking is over the last several months, the numbers of arrivals at the southern border have actually declined. Now, generally, as someone who follows the policy as closely as I do the politics, I would say it's dangerous to stake a political position solely on so-called border numbers, the number of arrivals, because again, these numbers are always going to tick back up. Occasionally, they're going to come back down. There's no way, if you're only ever fending off the numbers, you're never dealing with the kind of bigger drivers of migration. And so I would say it's always a political liability to stake your entire reputation on this question of numbers. That said, politics are politics. And interestingly, over the last several months, the numbers have really declined quite significantly. There are a few reasons for this. The biggest reason has been that the U.S. has really increased pressure on the Mexican government to arrest migrants traveling through Mexico, so to prevent them even from arriving at the U.S. southern border. Other reasons why these numbers have dropped have actually related to more expansive seeming policies that the Biden administration has undertaken to open up legal pathways so that people will come in a more orderly fashion rather than just showing up at the southern border. My point is, the administration had an opportunity to claim credit for some of these things. And curiously, it didn't. Now, I think the reason it doesn't tend to claim credit for things like the numbers dropping at the southern border is there's a general allergy to dealing with this issue because Democrats don't really see all that much upside in border issues. The public tends to assume Republicans are better. There's a lot of division among the ranks of Democrats. So there's a little bit of a reluctance to kind of take these issues on. But what's striking to the White House as it's plotting a course is you have a series of recent events that would actually seem to benefit the administration. So you have the numbers declining, as I mentioned. You have the fact that the administration and Senate Democrats were willing to cut a deal on a Senate bill that was fairly restrictive. It really did communicate a readiness to deal with the gravity of the situation at the southern border, and Republicans who had demanded that deal walked away from it. And so the president did have an attack line for a change to say, look, I'm willing to be tough, but the Republicans aren't letting me. Even through these moments of ostensible successes for the administration, the polling has indicated that the public hasn't really tuned in a meaningful sense, that people are still extremely critical of how Biden has handled immigration and specifically the border. And so I think there was an interest here in making very, very clear, given the politics, given the intractability of the polls and so on, that the president is willing to take decisive action.
We're living in a populist and nationalist moment, not just in this country. We just had the EU elections. Center-right and the hard right did well in some places, not everywhere. But populism, nationalism frowns upon foreigners entering the country. So who is seeking asylum these days? What I mean is the primary countries of origin.
It's interesting. Until very recently, I would say from maybe 2014 to 2022-ish, and obviously these issues are very fluid, you had primarily Central Americans from the so-called Northern Triangle of Central America showing up at the southern border seeking asylum. So people from Honduras, from Guatemala, from El Salvador. And that, at the time, was a sea change from what the U.S. government typically faced at the southern border, which was, in fact, not a preponderant number of asylum seekers, but rather single Mexican adults crossing the border and moving back and forth for work. So that was kind of a seismic shift in what global migration was looking like, or regional migration was looking like, and what that spelled out in terms of administrative difficulties for an American administration. Now what we're seeing is an even more complex phenomenon at the southern border, which is, numbers from Central America are always going to be relatively high. In some individual countries, they've dropped more than others, but for the most part, there's been a regional exodus in some form or another underway from Central America for years, and that's been a function of, until very recently, massive gang violence, political corruption, entrenched poverty, generalized violence, the ravages of climate change, and all the rest. Then layered on top of that, you have, and this is, I would say, the biggest development in the recent few years that has really changed the reality for everyone involved in this issue, a huge number of Venezuelans showing up at the southern border. Since 2015, millions, more than 5 million Venezuelans have fled the country. The country's economy has collapsed. Its government is tipped into outright totalitarian rule. Those numbers have steadily increased over the years, and now a huge number of people showing up at the southern border are from Venezuela. You also have large numbers of people showing up from Haiti, from elsewhere in South America. You have people increasingly from Africa and Asia. The population has grown much more global in the last couple of years, and that has been a function of all kinds of things. One of them, obviously, is the set of consequences associated with the COVID pandemic, economies battered in the region, global inflation, instability all over the world. But just to give you an example, too, because I think it's important to remind people how complex these phenomena are and how, we see a sudden moment of so-called border surge at the U.S., and there's kind of a whole historical backstory behind each one of these demographic shifts. In September of 2021, you may recall, there was a sudden arrival of something like 15,000 Haitians at the border at Del Rio, Texas. The lion's share of Haitians arriving at that moment were not coming directly from Haiti, even though in those months, the situation in Haiti deteriorated rapidly and gang violence was rampant and president was assassinated and so on. And so more people eventually fled. But the lion's share of people showing up at the southern border from Haiti in September of 2021 had actually been living in places like Chile and elsewhere in South America, having first fled Haiti in 2010 after the earthquake. So they were living elsewhere, trying to make ends meet in other countries. And then as one of the consequences of COVID and economies contracting and a general populist sentiment surging through the region and the wider world, these people were uprooted again and showed up at the U.S. southern border. And so the U.S. ended up deporting large numbers of Haitians from that Del Rio port of entry, that Del Rio bridge crossing, and they were sent back to Haiti, a country many of them hadn't been in more than a decade. Wow. And so there are all of these phenomena kind of snowballing and swirling together. And people really need to be mindful of that because the politics, again, north of the border are just so reductive.
What a complex issue. It does not fit well into the stupidity of partisan election year politics.
That is for sure.
The deep origins of these problems. I mean, this is the central argument of your book. The deep origins have a lot to do with U.S. Cold War policy in Central America, the support of vicious right-wing or military dictators in places like El Salvador by the Reagan administration helped destabilize those countries. I did not realize until reading your book that for most of its history, the U.S. never had a formal refugee or asylum policy written into law or codified. And the first question that springs to mind is, why?
Prior to 1980, the way successive American administrations dealt with issues of refugees and asylum seekers was on an ad hoc basis. And so the president had broad authority to issue what was called parole. And to allow people to come temporarily in moments of international crisis. And that's basically how the situation had been managed for years. Huge numbers of people came that way. Hundreds of thousands of people came through these particular acts of a president, Republican or Democrat, granting parole to a population in need. Hungarians in the 50s fleeing communist takeover of the country. You can go sort of region by region.
Cuba, there's a whole bunch.
Exactly. And so what would happen, the kind of rough arc of how this would play out would be that the executive would issue parole for a population. The population would come here, and then Congress would have to act to adjust or regularize their status. And so you'd see a bunch of what were called adjustment acts that basically then put the people who had come through parole on a path to eventually become citizens in the United States. Obviously, over time, this became unmanageable. It was very chaotic. I mean, it sounds chaotic even in how I'm describing it. And so there was a real push to kind of systematize what this practice looked like. When they did, Jimmy Carter was the president at the time, and Congress, as it was shaping the kind of contours of what this bill would look like, and it should be said, a lot of the thinking was to bring the United States in line with international human rights law, international immigration law, all of which had enshrined these protections for people being persecuted. The thinking was, okay, we've got two populations to deal with. We've got refugees and we've got asylum seekers. And the distinction between the two is that refugees are people in need who are being persecuted based on their identity, who we are going to sort of process and begin the legal process for resettling the United States before they come to the United States. So people who are overseas, who are in a faraway region, who are maybe in a refugee camp somewhere or who have made it to a third country and are waiting for protection. The refugee program deals with systematizing how the U.S. government vets those people's needs, backgrounds, and so on, and eventually resettles them into the United States. The other population of asylum seekers are people who show up at the U.S. border or at a U.S. territory seeking protection. This is a much more complicated population to deal with because, for obvious reasons, you have the suddenness of people arriving and the need for the U.S. government to react on the fly to giving people their legal right to seek protection. And so those two elements were what got actually codified into law in 1980. And almost immediately you saw tension between the promise of that law and geopolitics in terms of how the U.S. prosecuted its Cold War agenda in the wider region, and just administrative challenges. So yes. A few months after the 1980 Refugee Act was passed, you had what's known as the Mariel boat lift. 125,000 Cubans arriving on boats in the port of Florida. Immediately, the government was dealing with this immense complication of, okay, well, what do we do now that all of these people are here? How do we handle them?
Yeah, where you came from mattered. If you were persecuted under a communist dictatorship, that was a better way to get into the country than maybe another set of circumstances. And thank you, Jonathan. You answered my next question, the difference between refugees and asylum seekers. But yes, the Refugee Act, capital R, capital A, of 1980 was the first major piece of legislation. Something had been contemplated in 1965, but 1980 is really a milestone in this story. You allude here on page 49 to State Department officials, or page 50 of your book, who they're trying to come up with a number. How many slots do you think we'll need every year? And they came up with 5,000. If only they knew what was coming. But this is before NAFTA, before a lot of the tumult of the 80s. I mentioned El Salvador. So maybe 5,000 wasn't such a crazy idea.
You're referring to the framers of the 1980 Act coming up with targets for the number of people who could avail themselves of asylum at the southern border and be put on a path to legal status as asylum is designed to work. And at the moment, 5,000 a year was considered very generous.
Yeah, because there's only been a few thousand a year, right?
Exactly. And so there really wasn't a precedent for understanding what the scale of need might look like. And of course, history changed the circumstances on the ground. I'm grateful you make the point about how someone's ability to seek asylum depended illegally on where they came from. And when I say illegally, I mean the U.S. government was failing its responsibility set out in this very statute to give people protection based on the degree of their persecution, not based on their country of origin. Because what immediately started to happen in the 1980s is the promise of the 1980 Refugee Act collided with the reality of the Cold War. And so all through the 1980s, you had hundreds of thousands of Salvadorans and Guatemalans fleeing overwhelmingly repressive governments, military governments in their countries. But because the U.S. was allied with those military governments in their fight against the spread of leftism and communism in the region, there was an immediate problem that U.S. authorities faced. You had increasing numbers of people from El Salvador, from Guatemala, seeking asylum at the southern border. The conditions that they were fleeing were actually fairly textbook when it came to what asylum was meant to protect people from. These were people who were fleeing persecution based on their identities, persecution by repressive governments. This was exactly what asylum policy was supposed to prepare the U.S. government to handle. But what you started to see was in the kind of the mid-1980s, the grant rates for people who were seeking asylum were typically on an average around 20% nationwide. For people fleeing El Salvador and for people fleeing Guatemala, their rates of having their asylum claims rejected were 98 and 99%. So you basically, if you were coming from El Salvador or Guatemala during those years, you basically had a 1 or 2% chance of having your asylum claim granted. And the reason for that was the U.S. government couldn't acknowledge that its allies in the region were repressing huge swaths of their population and driving people to flee. And so you had the State Department presiding over the asylum process in the 1980s. And basically, the geopolitical bottom line for the U.S. State Department was what guided American immigration policy. And so as a result, you had people who had legitimate asylum claims that, again, really met the very specific terms of this newly written statute. But the U.S. government rejected almost all of them en masse because doing so is what allowed the U.S. to continue to prosecute its Cold War agenda in the region.
You do a great job of documenting all of this going back to the 1980s. The people, their stories that you follow, the reporting in your book is really, really remarkable. I felt like I was sitting there in the meeting rooms with the bureaucrats at what was then the INS, Immigration and Naturalization Services, questioning these poor migrants who had just gotten into the country because these people did, talking about Guatemalans, El Salvador, etc., did have legitimate claims. But the people processing the paperwork could find or easily find ways to deny them because it's actually pretty hard to claim asylum. Here's what I mean by that. You have to prove that if you are sent back to your home country, you could be tortured, face political persecution, not just, I live in a lousy place and I want to leave there. That's not enough.
One of the ironies of the 1980 Refugee Act was it gave the government a new pretext by which to deny people's claims, because they could say, look, we have a technical process here. We have a very specific set of circumstances that have to be met in order for us to grant asylum to someone. So sorry, we're sorry that what you're experiencing is horrific, but technically you don't qualify. Now, we know, because the historical record illustrates this, that the government was doing that in bad faith. And eventually, the U.S. government actually acknowledged that it had discriminated against asylum seekers from El Salvador and Guatemala, and it had to give an opportunity to hundreds of thousands of Central Americans for them to apply again or to find other means to regularize their status in the United States. But for the most part, what the U.S. government would say, its kind of rationale for rejecting these asylum applications was to say, look, there's no question that if given an opportunity, someone would come to the United States. There's opportunity in the United States. There's economic promise and so on. So sorry, you guys are so-called economic migrants. You are not legitimate refugees. That would be the government line.
Okay.
Another line that they would use is they'd say, look, you're fleeing generalized conditions of violence. So it's horrible that your country is in the midst of a civil war, but you are not facing specific identity-based persecution, even though, of course, in many instances, that is exactly what was happening.
Would you say today, though, so many of the people who are coming here, I mean, the only way to try to stay here legally is to apply for asylum, when really that is not what we should be doing, right? We should have a different kind of system just to accommodate all the migrants, people who are coming here for any number of reasons, primarily because their families are here or they are seeking better economic opportunity. But the asylum system is all we basically have.
You know, this is something that's hard for those of us who really believe in asylum. And I should say, I continue to believe in asylum. I continue to believe that the system can be refined and updated and improved and all the rest. And I think it's a foundational American ethos and as a policy matter, incredibly practical and important to keep in place. But for those of us who feel that way, it is important and uncomfortable to acknowledge that the majority of people showing up at the southern border right now, by the strict terms of the statute that exists, would not qualify for asylum. That doesn't mean large numbers of people don't have legitimate asylum claims. Large numbers of people do. So it's important that those people have an avenue for protection. But simultaneously, the fact that some people wouldn't qualify for asylum as such doesn't mean that they're not fleeing urgently, you know, or facing truly dire circumstances. So just to give almost a random example, because there are so many examples of this, take someone who is fleeing the consequences of climate change. A massive tropical storm has destroyed their home. They live in an agrarian area and they can no longer grow their crops because the climate is changing, the soil is eroding. They don't have a means of feeding their family.
Yeah, this has happened in Honduras and Guatemala in recent years, but go ahead.
Exactly. All over Latin America and all over the wider world. Now, someone like this isn't facing persecution as such. And so asylum isn't the right tool per se to help someone dealing with those circumstances. But the U.S. government hasn't created any other tools for people like that to address their situation, to provide for their families, to escape crippling poverty and hunger and immiseration and so on. And so, you know, what happens is right now, people point to the fact that the asylum system is overwhelmed, that it is performing a function it was never designed to. That's accurate. But the solution isn't to take asylum off the table. Yeah, the solution is to build legal avenues around the asylum system so that the asylum system isn't taxed with doing something that it wasn't meant to do. Yeah. But of course, you know, the reason why we can never really have that conversation is Congress is so deadlocked on this issue that there's sort of no hope of any movement toward kind of commonsensical responses to what's happening in the world. And so the asylum system kind of keeps taking it on the chin. It develops this horrible reputation. Everyone assumes that people are gaming the asylum system all the time. They're not. People are fleeing desperation. They're arriving because they have no option as to what to do to protect themselves and feed their families. The only door that's open even a sliver is at the southern border.
Well, as you document in your book, over the past 30 years or so, going into the 90s, the only aspect of the system that has been augmented is the enforcement aspect. And it was the Clinton administration that set up the legal scaffolding that then George W. Bush was able to use to really crack down, treating immigration like a crime after 9/11. Last question to you, Jonathan. Why did Ronald Reagan support amnesty?
I believe in the idea of amnesty for those who have put down roots and who have lived here, even though some time back they may have entered illegally.
You know, it's interesting. You can, like all of us who study this history, we sort of play this parlor game of you can like take quotes from Ronald Reagan or George H.W. Bush and put them beside a Bill Clinton, and you almost can't tell the difference. Or in fact, the most conservative sounding person of those three would be a Clinton rather than a Reagan. You know, I think Reagan's view of this was a kind of Chamber of Commerce style Republican view, which was immigration helps the economy. We want to give people an opportunity. It's the engine of our economy. I think that there was actually a real openness to this. And, you know, some of the things that didn't make it into that 1986 amnesty bill were things like efforts that he talked about openly in the press about trying to find ways of expanding guest worker programs with Mexico and so on. And so there was a much greater openness toward the idea of immigration. I think he saw it as an economic reality. He saw it as someone of kind of conservative economic principles, saw the benefits of immigration, but also did see it as a foundational American value. And so, there is this tension and contradiction based on how he prosecuted American foreign policy in the region and what this did to people all over Latin America, for instance. But in terms of people who are coming to the United States for work, he was actually fairly permissive and open-minded about how the U.S. should treat them.
It is true our borders are out of control. It is also true that this has been a situation on our borders back through a number of administrations. And I supported this bill. I believe in the idea of amnesty for those who have put down roots and who have lived here, even though some time back they may have entered illegally. With regard to the employer sanctions, we must have that, not only to ensure that we can identify the illegal aliens, but also, while some keep protesting about what it would do to employers, there is another employer that we shouldn't be so concerned about. And these are employers down through the years who have encouraged the illegal entry into this country because they then hire these individuals and hire them at starvation wages and with none of the benefits that we think are normal and natural for workers in our country. And the individuals can't complain because of their illegal status. We don't think that those people should be allowed to continue operating free. And this was why the provisions that we had in with regard to sanctions and so forth. I'm going to do everything I can, and all of us in the administration are, to join in again, when Congress is back at it, to get an immigration bill that will give us once again control of our borders.
On the next episode of History as It Happens, it'll be the next installment of our election series, the election of 1932. And our guest will be a great historian, David M. Kennedy. That is next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.